Alright, so you clicked on this video probably because you're wanting to start your YouTube journey, your content creation journey. Maybe you want to be a filmmaker or a cinematographer. But in this video, I'm going to give you videography basics in just a quick overview. So if you want a longer video, let me know in the comments. I'll think about creating one. But this is just going to be a quick summary of, getting started in videography if you just need to get like a quick crash course. So what videography is basically capturing motion and capturing continuous motion. So normally if you're a photographer, you're used to capturing, one single image, but basically a video is a collection of images. So the first thing that I want to touch upon is cameras. Alright, so now that we're touching on cameras, I'm going to start off by saying whatever camera is available to you is going to be the best camera for you. Personally, I use a mirrorless camera, but if you have a regular DSLR or if you have your smartphone, that can work. Honestly, when it comes to cameras, don't stress it too much. If you have the budget to afford maybe a more expensive video camera, go for it. But if you're tired for cash, use that smartphone, use that older camera. Anything can basically create videos. You just have to understand the basics. So don't stress camera, use whatever you have. Now the basics that I'm going to teach you in this video will apply to all these devices, whether it's your smartphone, whether it's your DSLR camera, a mirrorless camera, or even an older film camera. Most of these things will still apply. Okay, so there's 3 major camera settings that you have to master so that you can get exceptional video. It might not look the same if you're using your smartphone, but the settings are still there. These 3 settings are called ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Now those 3 things, they create what we call the exposure triangle. Now if you're using a film camera, it might not be called shutter speed, it might be called shutter angle. We just want to know that shutter speed and shutter angle can be used as variables to each other, but pretty much those 3 things control exposure. So the first one I'm going to touch on is ISO. What ISO is how sensitive your camera is to light. So in most cases, you don't want to have a too high of an ISO, because if your camera is too sensitive to light, you're going to introduce noise and grain. What I typically do is I try to keep my ISO at as low a settings as possible. If I have to adjust it, it's usually the last thing that I'll adjust. But that is just to see how sensitive your camera is going to be to light generally. The next setting I touch on is shutter speed. Now for video, shutter speed is basically how fast the shutter closes and opens. So there's a rule in film called the 180-degree shutter rule. What that basically means is that your shutter should be double your frame rate. I'll touch on what frame rate is shortly, but basically if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, or maybe I should go into what frame rates are. Your frame rate basically is the amount of images that are going to be in 1 second. So for 24 frames per second, your camera is capturing 24 still images, and that plays in 1 second. You can use 24 frames, you can use 60 frames, you can use 120 frames. Typically, I use 24 frames when I'm shooting because that is what we're used to seeing on cinematic stuff. On social media, most times social media displays at 30 frames per second. You can choose your frame rate accordingly. But when it comes back to your shutter speed, you want to use a shutter speed that is double your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, then you want to use a shutter of maybe 1/50 or a shutter of 1/48 if your camera does that. Shutter is basically measured in a fraction. So the fraction will be in terms of a fraction of a second. So 1/50 is 1/50th of a second. So whatever it is that you're shooting your frame rate, always try to double your shutter. Now there are times when you can break that rule. So for instance, if you go lower on your shutter, you're going to get more blurry looking motion because shutter controls how quickly the camera is capturing motion. When your shutter is less than double your frame rate, your motion is going to seem a lot more blurry. So I'll see if I can give an example of that. Actually, I'm going to just go ahead and change the camera so you can see that. So right now I'm shooting this video at 24 frames per second. If I change my shutter to 1/25 or even 1/20, then I'm just going to turn on my ISO. I'll change this back so you guys can get a better idea. But if you look at my hands, it's a lot more blurry. That's because the camera shutter is staying open for longer, so the motion looks different. Now if I change it back to let's change it back. So you notice as I change my shutter, the image gets darker because the camera is not staying as open for long. So now I'm going to adjust back my ISO back to where it was, and if you look, the motion looks more natural. Now let me show you what happens when I turn it up. So when I turn it up now, as you see, the image gets darker. Well, let me just bring up my ISO again. So basically you have to always be adjusting those values. So if you notice now, there's less blur. It looks more staticky or more choppy, and those are effects that you can use creatively, but for general everyday purposes, it's advisable to use double your frame rate for your shutter to give you that natural looking angle. Let me just turn this down again so I get back my correct exposure. So yeah, to keep things brief and simple, just try to use double your shutter for most instances. If you have a reason that you have to go above it, you can always do that, but for the most part, try to keep it in that line so you don't get too confusing motion and movements. If you have a reason why you want your image to look more blurry, feel free to go ahead and do that. If you have a reason why you want your image to be more choppy, do that as well. And then the next aspect of the exposure triangle is aperture. So what aperture does is, aperture is that little hole inside of your camera, and basically it's measured in what we call f-stop. Now, the higher the number, the tinier the hole is going to be. Smaller the number, the bigger the hole is. Now, when your aperture is at a smaller number, what's going to happen is it's going to have less things in focus, because aperture controls your focus. It basically gives your camera like a radius in which things will be in focus. So for instance, if you want to have your background blurred out, I know you guys probably hear that term all the time when you hear about a blurry background or bokeh. That is controlled by your aperture. So you know, you can be very much tempted to use lower apertures all the time and call that cinematic, but really and truly, your aperture should be based on what you're trying to communicate. So maybe if your background is very distracting, you can use a lower aperture to, one, let in more light into your image, but two, also, you know, blur out distractions and keep your subject in focus. But maybe if you're doing something like landscape, you want to have more things in focus, so you're going to want to use that higher aperture to have multiple things in focus. So right now, I'm using a fairly decent aperture. My aperture is 2.0. So notice when I'm right here, everything behind me is a little bit blurry. So that's kind of the idea. You use these things creatively and stylistically, but all of them affect your life. What I typically do is I adjust my aperture for what I want to be in focus. Then I double my shutter to my frame rate, and then I try to use the lowest ISO possible. And that way you kind of balance. Now, this is also going to be affected by where you're shooting. So if you're shooting outside and you know the sun is very bright, then you might have to introduce other things to kind of keep your exposure proper. So there's things called ND filters, which an ND filter is basically something you put over your lens, and what it does is it helps to darken your image so that you don't necessarily have to adjust your settings on camera, because the ND will block some of that extra sunlight. And again, you know, you can introduce stuff like lights. I have some lights in here, but these are photo lights. But if I had video lights, I'd basically adjust my settings for the video light. So you always have to basically adjust given your situation. I'm inside of a studio right now, so I have a particular lighting that's coming in. I have some sunlight coming out of my face. I think it's very flattering. But if I didn't, I might have to use one of these lights in front of me and adjust for that. So play around with it. It's going to be very complicated for you at first, but the more you experiment, you will get the hang of it. Basic tips that I'll leave you with is to try and use all these things creatively. Play around with your ISO, turn it all the way up, see how your image looks, turn it all the way down, see your image looks. Use high apertures, see how much things are in focus, see the feeling it gives you. Use low apertures, see what it does. Turn up your shutter, turn down your shutter, experiment. But you just want to have a basic idea of what those things do. The next thing I want to touch on is composition techniques. Now, I don't want to confuse your brain when it comes to composition, but all composition is the way you frame things in your image. Now, there are many composition techniques, lots of them that can really get very complicated. There's the golden ratio, there's leading lines, but to just keep it simple, a main one that everybody uses that is very common is called the rule of thirds. And what the rule of thirds is, so imagine that you divide your frame into 2 lines going down and 2 lines going across. this will create what you call the rule of thirds. Generally speaking, to give your composition some interest, you can put interesting things on one of those lines, and that kind of helps to direct your focus on the image. This is something that you use creatively. You do not always have to follow the rule of thirds. You need to understand rules so you can break them. Learn about different things that make your compositions look good. Learn about, symmetry. Learn about leading lines. Experiment with them. I personally won't stress that too much because honestly, you can break all those rules and still get good images, but it's still nice to understand the flow of things. Once you understand the science of it, you can break all the rules and you'll be perfectly fine. I personally, when I'm shooting, I love wide angle shots. I love low angles. So find the shots that you like and the shots that help to convey your messages. Different shots are going to convey different messages. So I'm talking to you, I have the camera on eye level because it feels more personal because it's eye level. But maybe if I wanted to communicate that maybe I'm superior to you, I'd put the camera lower and it would kind of look up at me. So it kind of makes you look up at me. So even though you're probably not thinking about stuff like that when you're shooting, that is something that goes into it as well. I could put the camera above me, so it's like you're looking down on me, maybe to give you like a bird's eye view of my situation, to have you, think that you're watching my story. So there's different ways to convey stuff based on your framing and your composition. So definitely, research that. That's something that you kind of have to experiment with. There's no one video that's gonna allow you to completely grasp composition, but trust me, the more you shoot, all these tips that I'm giving you is to go out there and practice. And the next thing I want to touch on now is lighting. So as you know, video is basically capturing light and capturing motion. So you have to be aware of your surroundings and aware of your situation. If you're shooting indoors, be conscious of if there's any windows around you, if there are any, lights in the space that you're in. Like I'm in studio right now, so we try to control our studio lighting. Luckily for me, we have a nice window right here where there's some really nice sunlight coming in, and that complements me. If the sun was behind us, it would probably be very dark and I'd have to use lighting. So experiment with your lighting. A general rule of advice, or something that people always suggest, is to shoot at golden hour, which golden hour is when the sun is rising or when the sun is setting. When the sun is rising or setting, it tends to be very soft and nice. So you don't have to do much. You just go out there into that, beautiful sunset or beautiful sunrise, and it will automatically just look soft and nice on your videos. Because without going into too much science, it's basically a time when like the clouds are, kind of giving you a little bit of coverage. The sun isn't as harsh. So it won't let the things in your videos look, I guess not appealing. It's just basically a perfect time to get some really nice, good looking shots. If you're a beginner and you're trying to find the best lighting conditions, experiment with those. Also, don't be afraid to try lighting. Something that I should teach you about lighting is you have two kinds of qualities of light. You have harsh light and you have soft light. Generally speaking, there's times when you want to use either one. Soft light is very good for, a regular day-to-day conversation, us having a one-on-one on this YouTube video. Nice soft lighting is going to be good because it feels natural, it feels nice. Harsh lighting might be to convey, stress, shock. It just doesn't feel as natural. So typically the sun tends to be very harsh during the day, and then it kind of simmers down as it approaches, sunset. And it starts off very mild. So early morning sunrise, very soft and nice. 12 p.m. harshest time for the sun, and as the day continues, it gets kind of softer and nicer. So if you're shooting outdoors, pick those appropriate times. If you're shooting indoors and you need to use lights, try to use as much natural light as possible. If you have to use extra lights, especially as a beginner, look into getting simple lighting setups. You don't need the most complicated lighting setup. Honestly, a window can do so much for you, but don't be afraid to use stuff like reflectors to just bounce some sunlight onto your face, or to use modifiers like this. All this is basically a big umbrella that is in front of a light, and what that does, it helps to keep the light soft for your face. The light does not have to be soft, but when it's soft, it looks a lot better on your face. All right, and the next thing we're going to touch on is audio. Now let me give you guys a secret. People will watch videos that they can't necessarily see the best quality. But if they can't hear what you're saying, it's simply not going to work, which is why audio is extremely important to video. That's something that a lot of persons struggle with. I won't lie, early on in my video career, I found it very stressing to invest in audio equipment because lenses are cool, lights are cool, but honestly buying a microphone is not the sexiest purchase. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Let me know if you guys love your audio gear. And this is coming from someone who is also like a musician. So I play the guitar, I like to sing, but I just didn't like buying audio equipment because it's just not as flashy. But crisp audio is very important. When people can hear the messages you're trying to convey and they can, understand, they're going to pay attention. So to give you some quick advice, even if you don't have any good audio equipment, something as simple as going into a quiet room or choosing a quiet time to shoot will be night and day for your videos. Because listen, I understand if you don't have the budget to buy a microphone, or maybe you're just using your smartphone, but that means you're gonna have to choose the right time to shoot. Now, if you do have a little bang for your buck, honestly, nowadays things are pretty cheap. You can actually get a nice quality microphone for your earphone or your camera for pretty cheap. Right now I'm using the Hollyland Lark Max, and what it's a microphone that comes with a receiver and a transmitter. I have the receiver attached to my camera and the transmitter in my back pocket with a lavalier. And what that does is, even though I'm not necessarily super close, you can hear what I'm saying because basically, the audio goes straight from my microphone directly to the camera. So investing in stuff like that will make your videos night and day apart. If maybe you're not doing talking head stuff like this, you can look into getting a shotgun microphone, or maybe if you're thinking about going into film, you can get a boom arm with a shotgun microphone attached to it. But just pay attention to your audio. If you don't even have anything for audio whatsoever, at least shoot in a quiet room. Trust me, your audience will thank you. And the last thing I'm going to touch on in this video is planning your shots. Now listen, this is something that deeply affected me for the longest while, because listen, I hated the idea of planning shots. As a creative, I just wanted to go in freestyle, freehand, and that was really something that held me back for a very long time. Even this video I'm shooting right now, even though I don't plan the exact words I'm going to use, I wrote down like bulletin points, because if I'm going to give my audience value, or if I'm going to create like a good story, I need to know the different pieces I'm going to attach. If, for instance, I'm here and I'm freestyling and maybe something comes up like a good idea and I'm like, wow, this is a great thing to add, that's great. But having an outline, it prevents you from just making, something and have no idea what you're doing. Because yes, you can create magic, but honestly, it's so much better to have some kind of structure, and that is going to be very big in your videography journey. I think that's something that lots of videographers neglect. Lots of potential filmmakers, the potential of a shot list and having a basic outline, some kind of script, some kind of storyboarding, that's going to set you apart. Don't just approach it, like you don't care. Even if you're just shooting TikToks, even if you're shooting short videos, have a basic outline of what you want to accomplish, especially for those videos, because even though they're short, that's exactly why you need to know exactly what you're doing, because the time is, so short that you need to give value in every single second. So with this overall set of tips that I've given you, you should have some idea of how to approach your videography journey. If you want me to create this into an even longer video, because I honestly feel like learning this in a short form is going to be very hard, but if you want me to create an even longer video and go into even more detail, let me know. If you did enjoy this video, you can watch this video right here.